All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Monday, February 7th of 2022. Thank you for tuning into the stream here today. We've got a lot of questions in our queue coming off of the weekend here, so excited to get into it. Plenty to talk about here. We'll talk a little bit about late swap, a couple questions about the entry editor, a few questions, looks like, or at least one question here about min uniques, and test builds here. So a bunch of interesting questions here. We'll get into everything. As always, if you have questions for me, this is open Q&A. Pop your questions into either YouTube chat or into the Office Hours channel in Slack, and we will answer questions in approximately the order that they come in here today. But I want to go ahead and get started right off the bat here with a bit of a discussion about our newest feature. This went live on Friday, actually. We did it kind of as a soft launch, so I know we did this without much of an announcement, but I know people are starting to see it, which is great, so I wanted to talk about it a little bit here today, and that is our new groups functionality. So I think there'll be a lot of excitement about this. I think there's going to be a lot of people that already know probably exactly how they're going to want to use this. So over the next, I would say, couple weeks, we're doing a little bit of fine tuning here. We wanted to get the core functionality out. I know there's a couple things that we still need to do here. And then we also want to work on our end a little bit on, just kind of our positioning for this, how we recommend people use this. So looking forward into the next couple weeks, we will probably be doing another office hours segment on this, serving as kind of a full breakdown, maybe even more of a strategy session about this tool, how we recommend using it, some strategy ideas with this here. But wanted to get started here right off the bat and just do a little bit of a demo and show you guys where this lives and how to use it. So let's get into it here. I'm going to go ahead and just say that we're talking about a groups demo here so that people joining in here know what we're talking about, know what we're doing. So let's get into it. We've got the NBA slate pulled up here for tonight, little 5-gamer on tap here. The groups tab the groups lives under this rules tab, which has been changed. If you've been a SaberSim user for some time, you may remember this used to say stacking. This is where a lot more just broader rules are living now. So we changed the name there. And now you'll see there's kind of two different sections here. So you're familiar with stacking. The new section is under groups. So what happens here? We'll go ahead and we'll go in and we'll say add a group rule. And this is going to bring up a little smaller version of basically the data that you see on step one. So player names, projection, value, and ownership. Gives you a way to kind of select different players to go into the group. So let's just pick out a couple players here. Not going to kind of talk about, strategy so much here just yet, but let's just say, in our group here is maybe Chris Paul, let's say Siakam, and let's do Josh Giddey here. So we've got 3 players in this group, and we'll go ahead and click save. And we've now got this little new rule that's going to pop up here. We can name this rule if we want to. So we could call this, let's get into the logic first. So you will have the same kind of operators here in terms of telling the builder what are you supposed to do with this group that you would have seen in the advanced stacking tab on NFL. So you can say equal to, more than, at least, less than or equal to, all these different things. So in this particular case, I think a rule like this kind of looks like a core, right? Maybe you've researched the slate and these are your guys. And you want to say, I want at least one guy, one player from this particular group in all of my lineups, right? So what this will do now is it will make sure that when we build lineups, Chris Paul, Pascal Siakam, or Josh Giddey are used in every single individual lineup. I mentioned before, we can rename this. So we could call this, maybe this is kind of our core players group here, right? So click the checkbox and call it this, right? If, for example, maybe we had a secondary group that we also wanted to add to this rule, we could add another group, right? And maybe say we've kind of got 2 different cores and we want to make sure one player from each core is used, right? So maybe this is, just as an idea here, maybe this is more kind of a value core, right? So maybe we have Thomas Bryant, Basley, and Quickly in every single lineup. So now this same logic will apply to each of these different groups, right? We can actually even rename the group names here. So we could call this, maybe this is, just as an idea, this is our pay up core, right? And maybe this is our value core, right? Just as an idea here. Trash cans obviously would delete if we wanted to remove it. This pencil icon will allow you to edit the group and add players or remove players. You can also remove them with this little X mark here, right? We can, of course, add another different group and put different logic in this. So let's collapse this here, and we could add a new rule, right? And I think this is kind of where you really get into some of the strategy of how this might be used. But let's look at some of our value options here. And maybe we want to set a rule. Let me see if I can see kind of. Okay, here's an interesting one, right? And we'll talk about strategy here a lot as we go forward, because I think there's a lot to unpack here. But I think a group I could see people wanting to set potentially is we have 2 value plays for the Wizards tonight in Thomas Bryant and Montrezl Harrell, who play a similar position and kind of occupy a similar role on the court. If we wanted to group those 2 players together and basically say max 1, we could add these 2 players, click save. And now we're going to change our rule. We're going to say, there's a couple different ways you could do this, right? You could set a few different rules. You could use the less than or the less than or equal to. But in this case, I'm going to say less than 2, right? Another option would be less than or equal to 1, right? A couple different logical ways to do this here. But maybe we call this our, maybe this is our correlation group, however you want to kind of call it, right? And again, we could continue to add more groups to this, right? So we could say, let's see if there's anybody else that kind of jumps here, right? That's kind of similar players that occupy a similar role here, just as an idea of how we might use this. Maybe, I think this one's maybe a little, let's see, kind of just trying to see. Let's see here. Maybe just as an idea here, let's do Gordon Hayward and LaMelo Ball, right? Again, maybe a little bit less of a sure thing there in terms of those 2 guys being really negatively correlated, right? But we could add those guys in there, right? So then when we go in here, we can go and then build our lineups. And these lineups will be built following the logic of the groups that have been set. So let's let this build here. We'll do a quick look here. We spent a lot of time too on some builder adjustments here. In general, right, you should see that similar build timing here in terms of builds should not take too much longer to get these things in there compared to how they normally have been. But let's go ahead and look at this here. And so I can't even now remember the exact rules that we put in, but one thing we could do is filter by Montrezl Harrell. And we'll see that there's no Thomas Bryant showing up in there. So that rule worked well here. Do we have it? We have some Gordon Hayward. Let's take a look at the Gordon Hayward, right? And we're going to see that there is no LaMelo Ball. The other rule that we had set with those kind of core plays, I think, are a little bit harder to audit, but we can see the players popping up here, right? I know Josh Giddey was kind of in our pay up core. I think Basley was in our value core here. Let's go look, actually. Let's just make sure. So we'll go back to groups. Yeah, so Basley was in our value core, right? So we're going to have all of these rules kind of get followed here, right? Last thing I'll note here on just kind of the tutorial side of this groups thing is that we can save these rules as well. So we can go ahead and click save rule here, right? And what it's going to say is, what do you want to call this, right? So we can call this our core players group, for example, here, and save that. We could also maybe save our correlation group and save that. And then we can actually load these rules here into future slates, into other slates that may or may not include that particular player. And let's talk about what that does real quickly here. So let's say we jump over to the night slate, right? And then we go into our rules, we go into our groups, and let's say we want to load our core players group in here. So when we do this, it's going to say, what do you want to do with the players that are in this rule but aren't in the slate, right? And we can say remove the players from that group, or we can just ignore the group entirely. So let's say we remove the players from the group, right? You can see now here, we've got the same cores of the remaining players. So it looks like it took out our Wizards and I can't, I'm forgetting who was in the original group, but it took out the players from the players playing in the early game. So if you want to, you could kind of set up groups that you use somewhat persistently, where the core of the players, especially if you're doing groups that are based more on negative correlation or something like that, the core of the players kind of stay and follow you along from slate to slate, but it only uses the players that make sense in that particular slate. So like let's load the correlation rule, right? Or remove the players from the group that don't correspond. In this case, it's empty because our correlations were for the early games. But the rule is still intact here. And if we wanted to add some groups for this particular rule here, we could go ahead and now do that. So very, very excited about this. Again, there is a lot to unpack here. I think even just beyond the tutorial of how to use this, I think there are a lot of interesting strategy components to this about how this would be used optimally if you were trying to add some value to your process with the group. So I'm going to talk briefly here a little bit about that. Again, we'll have more content coming out as we all get kind of familiar with this and start incorporating it into our processes over the next couple weeks. I'm going to mention just a couple things about it at first here while we're talking about it. So similar to how we described the stacking rules, right? Because we're already accounting for correlations and ownership and variance naturally in the builder, I don't think you necessarily need to, suddenly start kind of going crazy with this and add groups for every single individual correlated player or uncorrelated player or players with certain ownerships or anything like that, because we're taking this into account naturally in the build process. Right. So I would use this similar to how we describe stacking rules. If you want to add a little bit of additional control over to your lineup constructions, or if you have certain combinations of players that you want to make sure are showing up in your lineups or make sure aren't showing up in your lineups, I think that's a good way to use this. So what does that actually look like in practice? Here's how I've kind of been using the groups over the weekend. Here's how I'd recommend at least starting to kind of think about how you might use them in your process. So the first thing I like to do, again, is a test build that doesn't have any groups at all. And one of the things that I've really been paying attention to here as I've been using this over the weekend is look at what the sliders are for your particular contest, because and for the sport and slate, because I think it's going to help give you a little bit of a hint in terms of what you may want to do with the groups. So for example, 5-game NBA slate tonight, right? According to, where our back-tested sliders are, we're actually not even worried about correlation here. So I think on Saturday, or maybe it was Friday, we had like an 11-game slate, right? So let's jump back to Friday real quick. So we had a 9-game slate, right? So let's just compare what the sliders look like between those two. Okay. So on a 9-game slate, right, we had some value on correlation, right? It was a low correlation. On the 12-game slate, this might come up to moderate. On higher correlation sports like NFL and NHL and baseball, when we get there, right, correlation is going to be much higher. So essentially what I'm trying to say is I've been matching the way that I think about the groups from a strategic standpoint to what the sliders say is an optimal strategy for approaching that particular slate. So for tonight, for example, we have no real focus on correlation, but we have a high importance on ownership fade for these 20 max 10 to 50K contests. So let's run a test build and see what we're kind of getting out of this. Now, again, going through and setting groups for every single individual player combination you want to make sure happens on the slate, right, is exactly the way we've designed SaberSim to avoid, right? We don't want anybody to feel like they have to spend an hour building groups to build effective lineups. But I think you can use the combination of the default sliders and a test build to pick a couple specific spots and add a little bit of value based on what the sliders are telling you is important for that particular slate. So we know, based on the sliders, that for tonight's 5-game slate, ownership fade has a high value, right? Has a high importance. So we can go in here and kind of look, how are we navigating the chalkiest plays on the slate, at least at the moment, right? It's early in the day here. There's a lot of injury news still to come out. Ownership projections themselves might not be perfectly accurate, but we can kind of look here and pretend and see, of the highest owned plays on the slate, 2 of the plays that we are over the field on are Van Vliet and Basley. Now they're playing in separate games. They're not correlated to one another, But maybe on a slate where we're trying to fade ownership or thinking fading ownership is important, maybe we want to set a rule to say we don't want to use those two players in a lineup together. They are the two players that are the higher owned players on the slate that we are over the field on in our test build. So maybe we go ahead and go in here and build a rule in, right? And this is kind of more of an ownership kind of rule, right? So it was Van Vliet and Basley. Cool. And in this case, we're going to say less than or equal to 1. Right? So now we're good. And now I'm going to run another build. And I think having this kind of iterative approach of saying, I'm going to run the test build, I'm going to put a rule in, I'm going to see how it changes the lineup, see how it kind of changes things, and check again, right? And now we'll see what we're getting out of this. Okay, and now let's take another look here at the highest owned plays, right? So has it actually kind of a surprising impact, right? Has an interesting impact on the build here. So in this case, it said, okay, choose either between Basley and Van Vliet and give me all the Basley and give no Van Vliet. So I do think as you are experimenting with this, it will be very important to go through and make sure, for example, that this is having the impact that you want on your lineups, right? I'm not necessarily so sure that I'm just willing to just full fade Van Vliet now that this rule has been in place. So a couple options here, right? Maybe I go back and say that I want to at least be even with the field on Van Vliet, right? Maybe this is that I'm going to say, you know what? We're already thinking about ownership fade in the sliders. I'm going to just remove the rule and kind of proceed from there and go with it, right? So I think again, how I would recommend experimenting with the new groups functionality over the next couple weeks as we're getting familiar, a couple things. First is don't feel like you need to rush and go and create rules for every single team on the slate and all these different player combinations, because the reasons you would be doing that, correlation, ownership, variance, and diversity in your lineups are already still happening just in the natural way that SaberSim builds lineups. But I think you can use the default sliders, which give you a hint of the optimal strategy to use to play the slate, along with a select number of groups to kind of create the right combinations of lineups, right? To create the right kind of player combinations in your lineups can add a little bit of value, especially for those of you that maybe want some additional control. I am going to jump back quickly because I do think it's interesting. I want to jump back to this Friday slate because there was a little bit of correlation here that I think is. I just want to kind of show one other way, rather than thinking about this so much from an ownership standpoint, thinking about it from a correlation standpoint. I want to kind of talk about this real quick. So here's how I was looking at this on. Okay, so I have a couple rules in here. I'm just going to remove them so that we can kind of start fresh. Here's how I was kind of thinking about this on Friday, right, when I was first messing with this. So I ran my build, right. And again, in this case, the sliders are telling us that correlation is not a zero factor, but it's still low, right? And we're taking into account correlation in a minor way here. But I wanted to look at this and see, you know, were there any players in here that were really popping that maybe are a little bit negatively correlated, right? That are popping in a lot of lineups together. And how I was going about doing that, again, we'll make some adjustments here so we can actually see the lineups. Is I was going into the team stacks tab and looking at teams where I was getting combinations of players together, right? And then looking to see, you know, is there anything that I can see from the correlation of these players that tells a little bit of a different story? So one of those actually that popped for me on Friday that I was looking at is Josh Giddey and Darius Basley were both going into a lot of lineups. They were both projected really well, right? We can look at this and click into Josh Giddey and look at his actual correlations to the players playing in the team, right? Oh, actually, okay, here's actually a good example. And we see that these two players actually are very minorly negatively correlated. So in that case, maybe not something that I would act on. I'm looking for a player maybe that does have more of a negative correlation. So here's a really good example, right? So another situation, Troy Brown Jr., DeMar DeRozan, both projected very well, probably showing up in a lot of lineups of these Chicago stacks, right? We see when we click into Troy Brown that these players actually have a somewhat noticeable negative correlation, right? They occupy a similar role on the team. They both scorers, they're both wings, right? They're not heavily negatively correlated like we'd see with a QB in the opposing team defense, but they have this kind of minor correlation. Now, again, the builder is already taking that into account and saying it's still optimal to play these players together in certain lineups, but maybe you don't want to, right? Maybe a way to add a little bit of additional control over in the process is to separate them with a rule. So we can go in here, go back to our rules, create a group, and say in this case, DeRozan and Troy Brown. And we're going to say less than or equal to 1. And then let's try another build, see what we get out of this. So I'm not sitting here, I'm not looking at every single team on the slate. I'm not clicking into every single player on the slate and trying to set rules to account for correlations for everybody, because that's already taken care of for you. I'm picking specific spots with my roster construction where I'm seeing certain combinations of players showing up by default, and I'm tackling those particular spots. And what do we get now? Well, we still have some Chicago stacks showing up here, right? Now we're getting some Troy Brown and some Vooch together, right? Which I think I feel a little bit better about. They're not as negatively correlated. I'm interested to see, let's look at just our exposures overall. And it looks like we're actually still getting quite a bit of exposure to DeRozan and Troy Brown here. They're just now separated from one another. So maybe I'm happy with this, right? In the first example we did, we saw this really extreme result where we said, choose between Van Vliet and Basley. And the builder said, okay, give me all the Basley, until we adjusted exposures, right? In this case, you know, getting a kind of a more natural result here. Maybe this is something I want to roll with a little more comfortably. So another one that at the time, since now it's Monday and we're building lineups for last Friday with the projections having updated for all the news that broke throughout the night and things like that, we're getting a little bit different lineups. But at the time at lock on Friday, one combination of players that was popping a lot that I actually ended up setting a group for was DeJounte Murray and Derek White. Both of those players were projected really well. They also have a pretty high negative correlation or a relatively high negative correlation for basketball. And I set a rule to prevent those two players from showing up in the same lineups as well. So that is kind of a brief overview. Again, I think there is a lot to unpack here, a lot of opportunities. I think there's going to be very creative ways that different people find to incorporate this into their process over the next couple weeks as we all get kind of familiar and as new sports start up, right? NFL winding down, but NFL start of next season and baseball coming up in the spring here. I think there'll be some interesting and creative uses for how people end up using this. So we're super excited about it here. And again, we'll be doing more content to kind of help support this over the next couple weeks. But for now, again, I think, you know, this is just my take. This is what I've learned over about a weekend of playing with this. I would say stick to the general process that we've set forth in a lot of our other content. Start things with a test build. Figure out what the slate's looking like. Figure out where are your best spots to add value, right? It doesn't have to be every pit player. It doesn't have to be every game on the slate. Where are the best spots to add some value? I've been letting the sliders guide me a little bit in terms of what I'm thinking about. So tonight, I'm not going to look at correlations at all. I don't care if I'm getting multiple players from the same game, because the builder's basically telling us, the sliders are telling us it's not that important for a 5-game slate. But I might take a look at the ownership fade slider and make sure that, you know, for certain higher owned players that I'm spreading out and I'm not getting too many high owned players all in the same lineup together, right? So anyway, kind of a brief overview there. Again, if there are questions as you guys are playing with this here, or you notice anything a little funky, just let us know. A user, Phantom, did let me know today that this isn't showing up for golf yet, or for sports that, you know, previously didn't have stacking. So golf, MMA, NASCAR, things like that, right? That the rules tab is missing. So we're aware of that. We're working on getting that added. So you should be able to, you know, start using groups for things like golf or MMA if you want to. But super excited about this, and we'll see kind of where it takes us over the next couple weeks. So anyway, let's go ahead. I just wanted to start the show there, but let's go ahead now and start getting into questions here. So I'm going to go ahead and start. This was a question from Ryan here about mid uniques. And he said, where do you draw lines on I assume that's uniques? 3 to 5 game slate. Is it better to run 2 or 3 or 4 uniques? 9 game slate, run 4 or 5 men. Of course, this isn't always a rule of thumb due to how each slate may look, but in general, what's the thought? Thanks as always. Yeah. So interesting question here. First of all, I would probably never get up as high as like 4 or 5, even 3 seems like a lot of uniques, right? That's putting quite a bit of pressure on the builder to find viable lineups. You are sacrificing probably quite a bit of viable lineups to force this diversity into your process. Here's overall how I would think about min uniques. And this is my overall, this is how I essentially use them, is the min uniques function here is going to be a very brute force way of forcing diversity into your lineups. It's going to kind of make it that each lineup, when compared to a different lineup in the pool, needs to be more diverse against that lineup. And the reason why I call it brute force is really as a direct contrast against the sim variance slider. If you want additional diversity in your lineups, I think the best thing that you can do is just to increase the sim variance slider. And what that's going to do is it's going to use a smaller set of simulations for each individual lineup, right? Essentially widening the range of outcomes for each player and game on the slate. And it's going to, smooth out your exposures. It's going to have you have more natural diversity while using the real ranges of outcomes of players to get there, right? I think it's a more natural way of increasing diversity because it also increases your upside along the way, right? The min uniques functionality really is just a way of telling the builder that a lineup needs to have a certain qualification to make the cut to get into the final pool. It doesn't increase your upside in any way. It just forces diversity. So you might see where I'm going with this. The best use case I feel for increasing min uniques at all is if you want additional diversity on a slate where your sim variance by default is already 10. We can't get more diverse really than having a single game simulation for each individual lineup we're building. So if you are building, for example, on tonight's 5-game NBA slate, and maybe you're playing the Minimax or something like that, and your default sliders are sim variance at 10, which again is a single game simulation for each lineup, and you build a test build, and there's a lot of your lineups are somewhat homogenous, right? There's a core set of players that are showing up in a lot of lineups. The lineups themselves don't look very diverse. You want to force more diversity in. To me, that would then be a good situation then to increase the min uniques setting, right? But if you were playing, for example, down at 20 max or something like that, and your lineups again looked kind of homogenous, not so diverse, I would rather bump my sim variance up to 10 and use this set of sliders for this contest to get some more diversity in there naturally. So with all of that said, I think the most I would ever really bump my min uniques up would be like 2, maybe 3. I think you are just going to be throwing out a ton of lineups that are probably very viable by going any higher than that. So I would recommend sticking. It's also going to increase the time it takes to build your lineups, but I would probably recommend, I would say almost never would I go beyond 3. I think if you want to experiment with this, 2 is a good starting point, and I would only bump it beyond 1 if I wanted more diversity in a slate where sim variance was at 10 by default, because I just think this is a better overall approach to getting there. So, but that's my stance on it overall. Happy to hear from any users that are maybe using it differently than I've kind of described here, because I think, we added it to the builder for a reason. I think there's definitely use cases here for it. That to me is the most compelling use case, but definitely happy to hear from anybody else that likes using it for a different situation. So. Okay. And then a question from GEN here. And he said, I know you went over this a few weeks ago, but if I'm playing in different contests, some 3 max 11 to 100, a couple single entries, and a couple 150 max on FanDuel for NBA, how should I set the sliders to address all 3 contests while using the entry editor? You have a couple options here. And it's going to depend a little bit on your personal process of kind of what is, I guess, important to you and where you want to potentially make some sacrifices, right? So, for example, right, let's talk about this. I'm just going to stick to DraftKings here. Actually, let's just jump over to the FanDuel builder. I'm entered into DraftKings tonight. I'm not entered on FanDuel, but we can talk about this either way. So, if you did this particular process in a way that stuck strictly to the sliders, right? What you would end up doing is you would have one build here. So it looks like we have a couple. So let's say you have a 3 max that's 11 to 100 entrants, right? So you would have one build ran at these particular settings, right? So let's actually just run these. So we'll run this one first, then we'll run a single entry, and then we'll run a 150 max, right? So we have our 3 max, let's build a single entry. Let's just say the single entry is here, just for the sake of argument here. And maybe we don't need 500 lineups in the pool, so it builds a little faster, right? So this is kind of option one that I'm presenting here. And this would be building a separate build for each individual contest you're playing. And the advantage here, probably the biggest advantage, is that the lineups themselves are going to be optimized for that particular contest based on the sliders that we think are appropriate. You're going to get the right amount of ownership fade. You're going to get the right amount of variance, right? All of these things you're going to get are going to be appropriately optimized based on the sliders for the contest that you are playing here, right? So let's let this one build here. Cool. Okay, so then what's the potential downside of this, right? That sounds great. I want my lineups optimized for the particular contest. The potential downside here is that you are then going to manage 3 different builds here. So if you want to edit your exposures, you need to do it in 3 different spots, right? You'll need to, kind of edit your 150 max exposures. You'll need to go in and maybe hand pick, if you want to, your single entry lineup. You'll need to double check your exposures of your 3 max and manage them all separately, right? For some of you, that may kind of, that may be not a big deal at all. You may say, well, that doesn't sound like a big deal. That's exactly what I was going to be doing anyway. Then great. For me, for my particular process, I prefer to combine these together. And I prefer to combine them together basically so that I have a single build that I can manage all of my exposures from, and so that it saves me a little bit of time. Now, what I sacrifice if I were to be playing these contests is I'm going to have to choose lineups that's for one of these contests or another. I'm not building them with the perfectly optimal set of sliders. What I might do if I was playing this particular contest mix is pick sliders that are maybe a little bit halfway in between each of the options. So we saw for this one, it was, 0, 1, 4. For the 150 max, it was 0, 5, 10. I might do something, a little bit closer to this, right? Pick sliders that are kind of in between for the opportunity to manage everything all in one spot, right? So ultimately, it kind of depends on what is important to you. To me, I value higher the ability to edit all of my exposures in one build, to just have one build that I'm representing with all of my lineups and keep everything together, right? For you, it may be more valuable to, and maybe it's even a pro that you get to, maybe it's even a benefit that you get to edit your exposures selectively for each individual contest, right? That's probably valuable for some players, right? So it kind of depends on what you're looking for. I think for NBA, in a sport where a lot of times I'm doing my final lineups just 5 or 10 minutes before lock, if big news has broken, it's more valuable to me to do it all in one build and keep everything together, and sacrifice maybe having slightly suboptimal sliders for individual contests, right? So those are kind of the 2 sides of the coin there. If you're listening to this and you're like, okay, great, I get it, but just tell me what to do. What do you think is best? I would personally say I think it's better to make minor sacrifices to your sliders to have the opportunity to build everything in one place. If you've ever gone through the pain of trying to manage 3 different builds on maybe even multiple different sites and react to late news in NBA, it's frustrating, it's time consuming. And I think where you could have been spending your time adding value strategically, you instead are doing a lot of this admin stuff of having to manage all these different builds, which I just don't really like. So that's my approach. But good question there. Okay, so there's a couple questions here about the late swap tool. There's one from DVS here, and then one from Carl. And there might be a bug here, but I'm going to read the question first. So the question says, I set a lineup 30 minutes before the main slate start. I go into SaberSim to do a late swap, but somehow my lineups have changed and I can't swap anymore. I got this issue the last couple days. And Carl said something similar. He said that, after late swapping 15 minutes after lock, he got an error on upload. So I'm going to jump over to DraftKings real quick, just so I'm entered onto DK, so I can show this a little bit more. And I'm going to answer this in a very general way first of what I would do if this was happening to you. But I think it's possible that there might be a bug here that we need to look into as well. So I'm going to kind of talk about both sides of this. So first of all, let's say, the slate's active, right? We're doing the slate, and you go in and you run your late swap and you get an error on uploading that to the site. The best advice I can give if that happens is to go to upload new entries, re-download the template file from the site, upload it back to SaberSim, and then do another late swap. And that should almost always resolve any issues you were running into, right? Because what it's going to do is it's going to take the actual lineups you have in the contest, put them back into SaberSim and swap those. It should resolve any late swap issues. Now, I have heard from a couple users similar questions here recently, which makes me think there might be something that we need to look into. So I would say the next time this happens to you, if you can, DVS or Car or anybody else that's experiencing this, is go into your settings up here in the upper right, click report a problem, and give us kind of a quick description of what happened, and then click submit. And what that's going to do is it's going to send our developers some recordings of your sessions and some other data, and it'll kind of help us figure out what's going on. I have heard this from another user, Laddie. If you're here today, I'm talking about you. I know this has been coming up here a little recently. I've heard this recently where people are saying the lineups are not getting applied in a way that they expected, which has been a little bit tricky for us to research and nail down. So if it comes up, happens again, go ahead and go in here, report a problem, let us know, and that session recording will help us out a bunch. But for getting you through the slate, for getting it resolved, easiest thing you can do is upload new entries, re-download your fresh file, and start from there. So, all right, cool. Let's keep it going. I see we've got quite a crowd here now with us. So welcome everybody. Happy Monday. We're answering questions here. If you are asking questions in YouTube chat, I'll get to you soon. I'm going to rip through the rest of the questions that are in Slack here first. Starting next with a question from Terrell about late swap. And he said, "Hi, Jordan. So on the Friday night NBA slate, I had Luka and Vucevic in several lineups together. Later in the night, news breaks that Aaron Gordon would be out. I had a few lineups with Aaron Gordon, so I did a late swap. After doing this swap, Luka was removed from all my lineups that had Vooch and swapped for other players. The move cost me a couple top 5 finishes. Luka and Vooch scored over 70 DK points. I know a lot of this could be hindsight, but would it have better to do a quick swap instead of a late swap when it's not one of the big studs getting ruled out? I'm pretty sure that's what I'm going to start doing now, but is that the right approach? I'd really caution you against that, to be honest. I would actually say 100% of this is hindsight. When news breaks in NBA, right, it is going to have a pretty significant on the projections of all the other players, at least on that same team, and sometimes on the other team playing in that game, right? The goal with late swap is to increase the expected value of your lineups. It is basically, if we could replay this slate out 10,000 times, that the lineups that you ended up with after swapping were better than the lineups that you had before them, right? But that does not mean, unfortunately, that those lineups are going to be better every single time in the one data point sample that we actually get that night. So this can happen, right? And it can be painful, it can be frustrating, but the right thing to do in this situation is almost always still to late swap. Aaron Gordon being ruled out does have a pretty significant impact on the projections for the other Nuggets, right? He's a starter. He gets a lot of minutes. He's got a lot of usage when he's out there in terms of, actual usage, but also rebounding and assist rates and things like that. It makes those Nuggets better plays. So when your lineups get swapped and maybe it shifts around your exposure to Luka or Vooch to get better projected plays in there, it's a good thing. Even if it ends up, that means that you ended up with lineups that performed worse on that one single data point that night. So I would strongly, strongly recommend still continuing to stick to your process. And when news breaks, especially a starter getting ruled out, right? To me, that's already significant enough to keep doing the late swap, and don't sweat the single data point samples on what happens that particular night. This is going to pay off in the long term for you handling it with this. The only situations where I like to use quick swap, I guess there's a couple. One, I will use quick swap. If this situation happened to me, I will use quick swap at least immediately just to get Aaron Gordon out. You never know what's going to happen, right? There have been times for me where I'm late swapping. It's an NBA slate, and I do the quick swap, and I get the player that's out of my lineups and upload my entries file, and my internet literally goes down a minute after that and stays down through the late swap window, right? And in those situations, it is frustrating, but you feel so much better knowing that you're not at least getting a literal 0 in the lineup, right? You at least got the guy that's not playing out. So I always start with the quick swap and then do the late swap, right? Because you never know what's going to happen. So that's one situation I use quick swap. The other situation where I'll use quick swap is in sports where a player getting ruled out doesn't actually have a huge impact on the way the other lineups, the way that the other players in that game are projected. And I think the two best examples of that are baseball and hockey, where, let's say the Dodgers playing on the West Coast a lot of times have a lineup come out late, right? let's say you have some Dodger stacks and Will Smith was projected to be in the lineup. Instead, it's Austin Barnes, just for example, right? That doesn't end up generally having a huge impact on the Dodgers stacks. So for me, a lot of times I will just do a quick swap and literally either swap directly from Will Smith to Austin Barnes or just swap in the best available catcher and kind of just roll with it from there, right? Hockey's a similar way, right? As long as the lines aren't changing, if you get news that, maybe some skater skating on the third line, but the first power play gets ruled out and some other guy's just kind of taking his spot, that's not going to completely change the way that team is projected. And I think a lot of times a quick swap will just suffice in that particular situation. But for basketball and football, right, these guys getting ruled out, a wide receiver getting ruled out, a running back getting ruled out, maybe even the quarterback potentially, if their quarterback goes into the slate questionable, I think that's a little rarer, but Dalvin Cook playing in the afternoon game and gets ruled out, right? Dalvin Cook to Madison would theoretically work as just a quick swap, but you're now also probably have 3,000 additional salary that you probably want to make use of. It makes sense to rebuild the entire lineup, right? So in general, right, wrapping this one up, it makes sense. You should be doing the late swap in NBA, even if it ends up that on a given slate, right, your lineups end up getting outperformed by the original lineups, right? That can happen, and it's okay. So, but don't get off the late swap bandwagon, Terrell, please. All right, cool. DT Leo, a question about locking a player in for the single game for the Super Bowl. Yahoo single game contest or Super Bowl single game contest on Yahoo. How do I lock in a player for the superstar slot within SaberSim? Yeah, I was looking at this morning. Yahoo, I think, does something similar to what FanDuel does. So our lock button does something kind of maybe a little bit not what you would expect. So let's say, for example, right, let's say you want to lock in Cooper Kupp superstar, right? Here's what I would do. I would lock him in here, right? And that's what that's going to do, first of all, is it's going to make sure Kupp appears in every single lineup. So that's first of all what that's going to do. It does not necessarily mean you have superstar Kupp in every lineup because of the way that his player ID works, right? He has the same player ID in each position. So the way our builder works, it just makes sure that you have 100% Cooper Kupp, not necessarily 100% Cooper Kupp superstar. But I'd still lock him in step 1, so he's in every single lineup. And then I would use step 3 to just dial it in. So we'll let these build here real quick. And then we can see what our superstar looks like. And then we can click the lock button here. And now we're in business. So kind of combination of step 1 and step 3, again, just because of the way that they handle their player IDs. DraftKings, on the other hand, gives a different player ID to a Cooper Kupp captain and Cooper Kupp flex, for example. So you can lock him into the captain spot on DraftKings before the build, and it will just work as expected. If you're trying to do this on FanDuel or Yahoo, you'll need to do it this way. So good question. All right. Okay. Reed has a question here. Kind of a feature request, actually. So he says, hey, Jordan, is there a way to make sure of my 40 lineups that I've sorted by Saber score go into the $1 entries first and then the 25 cent? I definitely want unique, but when I double check, the worst 20 of 40 are going into the cheaper contest. If it's supposed to be random, I'm sure it is. Yeah. So, let's say hypothetically you're playing the quarter jukebox and the and one. Actually, it probably sounds like that's exactly what you're doing here, right? And you build 40 lineups. You want to enter them unique, but you want your top scoring Saber score lineups all in the $1 and your next 20 all in the quarter. There's not an easy way to do that at the moment, unfortunately. Common request. I think one way you can do it is just by managing your entries file yourself in Excel or something like that. But if you want to use the entry editors, there's not an easy way to do this at the moment. We are going to add this. This is a common request. It is on our roadmap for some of our next improvements we want to make to the entry editor. So look forward to that. In the meantime, I would say either you can do that in Excel if you want. I would say alternatively, there's typically not going to be such a significant difference between projected score or Saber score amongst your top 40 that you're you're actually going to lose out that often here, right? It could be just as likely that by pure luck, your 35th overall lineup is your highest actual scoring lineup and it went into the $1, for example. I know it's nice to know, for example, that, I think it's nice to know mentally that your top overall lineups were in the $1, right? I think it can avoid some tilt. I don't think it actually has a huge practical impact, but with all that said, we do want to add it. So it's coming, but DT Leo, I just saw this pop up. I actually just answered this. So just like maybe literally just the question before that, if you want to rewind to the stream, I just answered this question. Short answer is you lock them in on step 1 and then just click the lock button on step 3 into superstar position. And that should take care of that for you. So, all right, cool. Let's keep it going here. A few other questions from Slack, and then we'll move from here. Or we'll move to YouTube chat from here. So GEN says, is there a way to filter players less than a certain amount of minutes? There is in the player filters here. So to the right of step 1, review player pool, we have this player filters option here. And you can go in, you can set a filter in here for virtually anything that you actually see here on step 1. So in this case, we can add, you see by default, there's this filter for players under a certain amount of fantasy points projection, but we can add a new filter and say, for example, exclude players where minutes is less than 20, right? Maybe you want only players that are projected for at least 20 minutes to be in your pool. So you go in, you do that. And then if we reverse the sort on the minutes, we can hide removed players here. And we'll see that now the lowest minutes projected player in our pool is Rui Hachimura, projected at 20.68 minutes. So, but for now, I'm going to remove that. But that's how you do it up there. Cool. So now we can see that that removed 5 players from our pool. So, one thing, be careful with that, right? There are players that have lower minutes projections here in that are actually pretty good plays, right? High fantasy point per minute guys that don't have as much of a minutes projection. That makes sense in here. The other thing to note with this, if you're going to actually do this, is that we take into account minutes variance in our sims. So like, let me look at a particular example here. I guess someone like JaVale McGee, at least this is somewhat anecdotal, but I feel like he has like kind of a higher minutes variance than other players, right? We've seen situations where he does get somewhat more significant run in a game. The Sims will pick up on that kind of thing. So if you're getting some McGee in there, it's possible that you're not getting a McGee lineup where he outperformed his expectation in 15 minutes. You might literally actually be building a lineup for a Sim where he got 25, right? And a guy that's going to have more than, 1 fantasy point per minute playing 25 minutes probably has a ceiling outcome. So, but. And then another question from Reed here about the groups functionality here. If a member from a group is out, what happens? It's a good question. So on this kind of stuff, let's see. Let me see if I can find a guy that's actually already ruled out. There we go. Okay. Let's do Tyler Hero just for the heck of it. So, one thing I'll note here on the new groups functionality is that there is some data validation in here. So for example, if you set a rule that says just Chris Paul, right? You can see if I want at least 3 players from this group, right? We're going to pick up on the fact that that's not possible and it won't let you build. I would say there's not perfect validation here, right? So it is possible to set some groups, maybe you're saying that you want at least 1 player, right? If you did something like this, right? Let's see. Right. So this isn't going to work, right? This rule says at least 1 of Chris Paul, and this rule says no more than 1 or less than 1 Chris Paul, and it's still going to let you build. You'll get an error if you do this. So there's not perfect validation here at the moment. So that's one thing to watch out for. I imagine that it will let you do something. I imagine if you put like Tyler Hero in this, right, and add him, and say at least one, right? It would let you build. So I think thinking about this, right? If you go in, let's say you build all your rules at like 4 o'clock or something like that, and then players, as the slate goes on, right, players get ruled out, right? They may still be in your groups. I think that's an interesting idea of something to add, right? Again, I mentioned here at the start of the stream, this is kind of version 1 of the groups, right? Some smart tracking of the groups to remove players that proceed to get out, I think is a cool idea. I'm pretty confident based on the fact that we can build a rule with Tyler Harrow in it right now that doesn't work. So be cautious of that, right? Keep an eye. Probably makes sense before lock to do kind of a sweep of your groups here. Make sure everything's looking good. And I would say also probably makes sense to build your groups as late as possible to get them in before the slate locks. It's also another reason why, probably makes sense to not go in here and try to group out every single team on the slate, because you don't need to, and it's just going to increase your administrative time of building all these lineups quite a bit. So, but good question. And then let's jump over now to YouTube chat and answer some of these questions coming in YouTube chat here. So Dante says, hey, Jordan, how many points up or down is too much or not enough for NBA projections? Good question. There's not a perfect answer to this, but I would say if you want to increase or decrease projections on a player, I like to start with 10% bumps, right? So maybe you're going through and when we just built this, who were we getting a lot of? We were getting a lot of Basley, right? And maybe we want to be a little bit under on Basley. Maybe we feel like that's a little bit too much exposure, or maybe he's projected a little high. Don't know how much to adjust him. I like to start with 10% bumps. So in this case, 10% down would be like -3 roughly. And then what you can do from here is run another build, right? Make some of these subtle changes, run another build and see what you're getting from there, right? And see if you want to make some more adjustments or less adjustments. I would say, on the flip side, if you're running a build and getting a ton of a player that you don't want, and you drop his projection by 10% and you're still getting a lot of him, I would be cautious and maybe rethink the way you think about that player, because really what that's saying is that if that player's mean projection is actually just 90% of what the builder projected, he's still a really good play, right? And at that point, I would actually maybe be more inclined to actually include that player in my lineups, right? But if you drop a player by 10% and you get and you get none of him, right? That means his original projection was kind of somewhat fragile at that particular point. And maybe it's a good idea to fade that particular player. So vice versa, right? Maybe you're like, man, why am I getting no Vooch, who went off apparently according to Terrell here? I assume he did, but who went off on Friday, right? Who's playing well, right? Whatever your reason is, right? Why am I getting none of him in my lineups, right? He's projected for 4.07. Let's give him a 10% boost and bump him up to 45.09, right? And then you build from here and you're still not really getting a lot of him. Maybe you get a little bit more, right? At that point, what's that saying? That's saying even if his actual mean projection is 10% higher than what he's projected, he's still not a great play. And that means not only do you have to climb that extra 10% in the slate tonight, you have to kind of get even more than that for it to pay off. So that's kind of why I like that 10% line in terms of projection bumps or drops on players, is because it allows you to have a little bit of an impact. It allows you to adjust things, but you still kind of take into account the sims in a healthy way, and it gives you an opportunity to kind of check yourself, right? So, like if you went in and bumped Vucevic's projection to 60 points, you would certainly be getting a lot of him. But what that's actually saying, that's actually a very risky stance to take. So. Demetra says, what's the video name for the NBA process and college basketball process? So on our YouTube channel, we have this grouped here. NBA, all of our NBA content is kind of in this course. A couple of videos that maybe you're referring to. I think these first two videos, this first one's about contest selection, and the second one is about general NBA strategy. Really good videos to watch. There's also the video where Max recorded his NBA process. Right here, which I think maybe is what you're referring to. We don't have a lot of college basketball content at the moment, mostly because we don't yet have college basketball sims. It's something that we want to add in the future, and we'll support that with some more content when we get there. But for now, I would say if you're playing college basketball, a lot of the core principles will probably still apply from the NBA content, because it's obviously the same sport, right? there's some nuance on the DFS side on how those two sports would play differently, but I think that should kind of sub in terms of at least the core concepts of how to play the sport for now. So Jack said, happy Monday, Jordan. Can I or should I reset my exposures after each slate before a late swap? After each, I would assume you mean after each slate of games. Interesting question, right? Very interesting, right? Because like, let's say, for example, we have a situation where we've set a minimum exposure on, I don't know, let's see. Maybe we've set some minimum exposures for players playing in the Suns and Bulls game, right? Or, we want to target that game. We like that game. We've set minimum exposures for players playing in this game. But after lock, the Warriors say that we're going to rest Steph Curry tonight, right? Now, all of a sudden, how do the Warriors project, right? Well, the Warriors now project really good. But when you go to late swap, you've set all of these minimum exposures for this Suns and Bulls game, right? So the question is, should I reset that? There's an interesting push and pull there. I would say yes. And in fact, I've said a lot here on stream that part of the reason I don't worry about exposures as much, I don't do as much of my own research build process like I do for baseball and football and other sports in NBA, is because I'm like basically counting on news breaking throughout the slate that kind of invalidates those exposures. So I would argue, yes, I think you are probably best off letting some of your exposures go if news breaks to late swap. Now, if minor news has broken, right? If there's maybe something kind of small, maybe we get a slightly different starting lineup than expected, right? Maybe you don't want to blow up your whole strategy for the slate and delete all your exposures. But I would say if a starter has gotten ruled out, essentially, right, it probably has opened up value that has changed the context of the slate, at least somewhat. And I would probably be willing to sacrifice my exposures that I set at lock to late swap more optimally later. I would hate to be prevented from getting the optimal amount of Warriors value when late swapping because I had minimum exposures set on less projected, less highly projected plays playing in a completely different game. So my answer to that would probably be yes. And actually, even more broadly speaking, right, even kind of taking a step back, the reason I don't set a bunch of exposure limits in step 3 pre-lock is because I'm counting on this happening post-lock. So really good question. And then Jack said, I feel the group tab that was added has put SaberSim on top of all other optimizers, but do you think adding too many options to the Sims can take away EV from our lineups? Yes, frankly. I think you could overgroup your lineups, right? Because again, what the builder is kind of trying to do is build lineups taking into account correlation and ownership fade and variance, right? So if you are going to go in, like on tonight is a good example. The very first group we built was Thomas Bryant and Montrezl Harrell, who I am sure if you built enough lineups will show up in lineups together, right? They are, let's see. They have a negative correlation of 0.06, right? So the Sims are picking up, and Hachimura is in the mix too, right? So we have these three guys, right? Together, these three players have a negative, a kind of combined negative correlation to one another because they do similar things on the court. Right. And I think it is correct to say that. But the Sims are saying that negative correlation is actually relatively small. And the default sliders are saying for a 5-game slate, we don't need to worry about it at all. Right. Now, the fact is they do still have a minor correlation. But is it worth completely removing lineups that have those players together to account for that correlation when there are also clearly Sims, right, on a high sim variance where those players are going to succeed together, right? Like, very easy example is, all it takes for those players probably to outscore their projection, even when used together, is this game going over its implied total, right? Implied total for this game is what, 208? Well, if this game goes to 220, right, almost every player in that game is going to be successful. And on a 5-game slate, it probably makes sense to use those players together. So this is where it's going to get very interesting. I think this is where it's going to get very fun. I think groups is firmly in that kind of more advanced strategy part of the process here. And it's why I would say, play around with it, explore. If you can find some time to explore this when you're not right up against lock, play around with it, see the impact that setting groups has on your lineups. But kind of, I don't want to say approach with caution because I don't want to scare anybody off. I think this is a really cool new functionality. I think this is going to be a lot of fun to use, but just keep in mind what each step of the process is telling you, right? Run your test build, see what you're getting, pick your spots, look at the sliders as a way to kind of figure out what is the strategy that I should use for this particular slate, and then set a specific set of groups, a smaller kind of set of groups to try to kind of tackle or get an edge in a particular way on the slate here. But like, for example, for tonight, I will be unconcerned with correlation in my groups. Like I will play negatively correlated players together in lineups because I don't think it matters that much on a 5-game slate. But I do think the idea of setting some intentional, maybe ownership focused groups on tonight's slate might be interesting. And that's just the way I think about it. Again, I think there are a lot of different ways to think about your groups. Again, one of those ways might be a core player kind of approach, where maybe you do some research and you don't have the opportunity to research every single team on the slate, nor do you need to. But maybe you think there's a couple guys that are going overlooked and you just want to make sure one of them is in each of your lineups, right? I think that's also a really good way to use the group. So, but yes, to the answer to this question is I think you could very easily, you could make bad groups that make your lineups worse. But I agree with the general sentiment here. We are really excited about adding this. I know it's something that, some of our competitors and other tools have had for a long time. We've gone back and forth on frankly, the need for this functionality for a long time because of the way SaberSim works. And ultimately, we kind of came to the decision that, we wanted to add this. We do think it's a powerful tool that gives you additional control over your lineups. And, especially, for those of you that kind of want that additional control or want to have a little bit more of or want to, maybe dial into specific strategies a little more, I think it's useful. And you might disagree too. You know what? Maybe you come at it from this standpoint. Maybe you say, yeah, I don't want to build my lineups with overvaluing correlation for a 5-game slate, but knowing that these players that are all projected well are negatively correlated, I'm going to build the rules in there anyway. Right? Maybe you disagree with the lineups that are coming out originally, and you say, like, no, for these players that occupy the exact same role on the court or a very similar role on the court, right? I imagine Harrell and Thomas Bryant and Hachimura, the three of them probably. I don't know the Wizards' rotation very well, and I think Hachimura, if I can remember correctly, is pretty recently coming off of injury, right? I would imagine these players do not share the court very often, right? I think it's going to take a somewhat of an outlier situation for them all to be successful together, right? Maybe a situation where the game goes well over the total, maybe a situation where the game goes to overtime, and maybe you want to set that rule in there. So it's interesting. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I think there's going to be a lot to unpack and kind of dial into as we do this. And we're just talking NBA here, and we're only talking about a 5-game slate. So I think there's going to be a lot to talk about here with the groups over the next couple weeks. So. Jared, thank you for being patient. I see your question came in a couple times here. For NBA, when running 150 lineups, if a player is projected at 45% owned, is there more value in being over or under the field? It's going to depend on the size of the slate, and it's going to depend a lot on how that player is actually individually projected. So what I would do here is I'd recommend starting with a test build, right? So let's say you're playing like the fadeaway, right? The big one, or maybe just the mini max or something like that. I would build this. I would build 1,500 lineups and see how are things looking, right? How is the builder navigating the chalk for tonight's slate, right? Because again, it's going to depend on how players are projected. It's going to be different on a 12-game NBA slate and a 5-game NBA slate. So we run this build and we can go look and we can see, how are we with 10 sim variants and 5 ownership fade navigating the chalk. And what we'll probably see is that there's going to be players projected to be highly owned that we're over the field on, and there's going to be players that are projected to be highly owned that we're under the field on. Right. So let's just run this and see what we get out of this. And this, I think, is a good place to start your research, right? There's not a one size fits all answer. I wouldn't be able to tell you based on this question alone that player is an insta fade, right? What if they were projected for 10x salary, right? Then it probably makes sense to have 100% exposure to them, right? But you can see here, let's look at the highest projected owned plays on the slate. So highest projected owned play on the slate, Gordon Hayward at the moment, we're actually slightly over the field, slightly even with the field, but just under him, Donovan Mitchell is almost a full fade in 150. Right. And you can kind of see this spread from here of the projected to be the chalkiest plays on the slate, how we're navigating each individual player. Right now, it doesn't mean you need to approach it this way. In fact, I bet if we said, we want 30% Donovan Mitchell, right, it's not very hard for the builder to get there. Right. This is just the top 150 pool lineups of the pool. But I think in general, Well, no, I actually, I don't even want to make a generalization here. I think the easiest thing to do is to run a test build and get an idea of how the builder is going to navigate those individual situations for that particular slate. So, HC said, "Hey Jordan, I did a lineup using percentiles, and you noticed that the Saber score and average lineup was the same one as the percentile I tried. Is that normal? I figured it would be different." It can be. Let's look. So we have average percentile, and then let's say 95th. Give this a second to load. So in this case, it changed, right? Actually, interesting impact here, right? Especially the way the chalk is getting navigated here. Oh, actually, whoops. Let's do that. Actually, hang on a second. I messed something up here. Let me back this up. Percentiles will not work with custom projections. So if you have custom projections set, proceed with caution with your percentiles because they do not work together. So let's go ahead. Okay. And now we can go back. So our custom projections are reset, and now we should be able to go in and set 95th. Anyway, my lineup changed. It's definitely possible, especially in a sport like NBA, where you could change your percentiles and still see the same lineup at the top. The reason why that is because players in NBA have one of the more normal distributions of outcomes compared to other sports. They're not perfectly normally distributed, but this generally has this bell curve kind of look. And what that means is that a player that is projected to be a very good play at the average projection is generally also projected to be a good play at the 95th percentile projection, right? So the percentiles in general on NBA are probably going to have one of the lower impacts compared to other sports. Now, as you go to things like 95th and 99th percentile, right, it's going to have a bigger impact because you're talking about a much higher ceiling outcome. But in general, right, the impacts of this are going to be somewhat lower in NBA compared to a higher variance sport, a less normally distributed sport like NFL or baseball or hockey or something like that. But it would not surprise me if, especially if you built a smaller pool of lineups and maybe a lower sim variance setting, right? If you built with a very low sim variance setting, you are building with a very high importance on the average projection to begin with. So then when you change it to sort by the percentile, the impact of that is even going to be a little bit lower. So, but good question there. Okay, so I realized there were a couple questions that I had missed that went back all the way to Friday. So I'm going to hit these real quick. I have 2 here left over. If there are any other questions from you guys watching here, good opportunity to get them in the queue now. I'm going to answer these. If I don't get any other questions coming in, these will be my last 2 for the day here. So let's hit this one. This is from Andrew first. And Buffbeard and Andrew, if you guys have been watching this stream and waiting along for me to answer your questions, I apologize because you guys were technically first here. I just didn't see them because they came back. They were from last Friday. But Andrew said, if I run a stack rule in NBA, should I be running my test build with that rule since I know I'm going to use it? I would argue no, personally, because I think the purpose of a test build is to give you an unadjusted and unadulterated look at what the slate looks like that particular night, right? I don't think for NBA it's going to have a big negative impact, right? If you use a rule like no more than 3 players from the same team every night, it's not going to dramatically change your test build, but you might miss out on an opportunity on a slate. Maybe you don't have a lot of time to do a lot of research. You're trying to run a test build 20 minutes before lock, and you set that rule in there, and because of that, you don't realize that it's one of those weird slates where there's like a super value team where one team has like 4 players projected over 7x or something like that, right? So I would probably say when you're running builds that are test builds and research builds and things like that, to unlock the builder as much as possible, to let it build kind of as naturally as possible so you get the most value out of that research process. But good question there. And then Buffbeard asks kind of an interesting question here about fantasy point per minute. Said, how does SaberSim account for NBA fantasy points per minute? How can we see this metric? So because we're simulating games out play by play here, historical fantasy point per minute, I would say, doesn't have a direct role in the simulations. What we do look at is rates of players doing the things on the court that ultimately turn into fantasy points, right? So like Chris Paul, for example, our highest projected player on the slate tonight, right? We have an understanding of what his usage rate is, his assist rates, his rebounding rates, his steal rates, things like that, right? And those things are all coming together as we simulate out each individual game of the Suns versus Bulls games tonight. We're taking that into account. So we don't, I would say we're not necessarily looking at historical fantasy point per minute. We are looking at, historical rates for what a player does on a basketball court. And then we have a way of kind of dealing with that information, that historical information over time, right? We treat information that's happened more quickly, or we treat data points that have occurred more recently more valuably in the builder, right? So that's not something necessarily that shows up here. I think this question also has come up with usage before. People asking, can I see historical usage in the app? And the reason these things aren't there right now is just because they're not, at least as I understand it, not key factors into the simulations themselves, right? We have a sense of a player's usage in their individual sims, but we're not overly concerned with what the historical usage is for that player over time. I think there are plenty of other good resources out there that will give you that information, right? But it's just not something, if you wanted to get a fantasy points per minute for a player for our sims, the easiest thing to do would be to take their average projection and divide it by the minutes, right? You could do that in an Excel by just downloading the projections. I think would probably be the easiest way to do that. One thing we do want to add, this is something probably a little bit further down the line, but something that I think might be interesting to you here, if this is something that you want, is right now you are kind of at the whims of the data that we provide based on our sims. And I know fantasy point per minute or historical usage or these other things are important to people's processes out there. So in a future update, again, this is something that's it's in our roadmap, but I don't have an estimated date or anything like that for that. We want to add the ability to add custom data here, and then also to filter or build lineups potentially based on that. So you could theoretically upload not just projections, but upload, historical usage or historical fantasy point per minute, if that was useful to you, add a new column for it here, and then filter or do other things based on that data here in step one. So that's something that's kind of on our radar, something that we would like to add in the future. At the moment, not something that's super easy to do beyond, I would say, downloading the projections, calculating the sim fantasy point per minute for yourself, and going from there. So. But good question there. And then I saw a question from John here. A little confused on this one. Says if we select certain players in step 1 and change our sliders in step 2, I think maybe we're just missing a word here, John. Will our players be in step 3? Yeah, I don't know. A little confused on this one. But maybe just misunderstanding there. So let me know if maybe there's another way you can write that, or sometimes if somebody else kind of gets the gist of what this question is, sometimes other people hop into the chat and explain the questions when my brain's a little fried and I'm not getting it myself. So, but anyway, I'll wait a couple minutes here. Let John take another shot at this here. And again, on the groups thing, very, very excited to get this out to everybody. I think, as you are building lineups here for different sports, different slates, contest types, things like that, let me know creative ways that you're coming up with using it. If you have any questions about it, I think it opens up kind of a whole new world of the way that you can build lineups with SaberSim in here. So very excited to just, see what people do. Again, I have been experimenting, just over the weekend and come up with a couple creative ways of how to use it here, but I think there's going to be a lot more to talk about here in the coming weeks. Let's see, question from Raul here. How do you set up your exposures with the player pool of, let's say, 23 guys, DK, GPP, 20 lines? Well, it's an interesting question. First of all, if you wanted to play with kind of a very tight pool like that, the way I would go about doing it is remove every player from my pool to start with, and then add in, my players here, right? Maybe they're just the best overall set value plays. So like let's just add in, let's do this just for fun. Right? Let's add in let's add in a couple pay up plays too here to just build out a little bit of a player pool. Okay, let's do something like that, right? If you use kind of a tight player pool like that, the sim variance slider is going to be the biggest determination factor of what your exposures are to each of the players in this pool. So if we go in here and build, right? Let's see. We'll see what happens here. I don't know if I actually put in okay, I did. I wasn't sure if I actually put in a viable pool there in terms of positions, but okay. So I think one thing that you're going to see here is if you're taking this approach and you're playing with a pretty tight player pool, the builder is going to probably lock you into a more concentrated set of exposures than it otherwise would have, right? Like we ran a test build at basically the exact same settings earlier without that player pool limitation here, and we can kind of compare our exposures. So you can see this was basically the exact same build earlier with no limitations on our player pool, and we don't even have a single player with 100% exposure in our pool at the moment. And then when we jump back over here, we have 4 players with 100% exposure in our pool. So from here, right, you've got a pool of 500 lineups. You can make adjustments to your exposures to your top 20. So if you wanted to say, you only want 80% exposure to some of these guys, right, you can start adjusting your exposure to these players here in step 3. Whoops. Hang on. There we go. And what we'll do is we'll sort through your pool of 500 to find your best 20 that correspond, that match up to these exposures you've set here. I would say, in terms of what is the right thing to do with these exposures, that's mostly independent of whether or not you've curated your player pool like this or not. This is mostly a risk tolerance thing. So, as you drop your exposures, as you have lower exposure to each individual player in your pool, you are going to spread out your risk. You're going to lower your variance, but you may also lower your upside or your theoretical ROI for that particular slate. So that's less about, strategy and more about your personal risk tolerance. I like to think about exposures in generally, as it relates to the player's ownership, right? Like, looking and seeing what are my highest overall exposed players is one thing. I like to look at it instead and say, what are the players that I'm most heavily over the field on, and make sure that matches up to how I want to tackle the slate. So, because sometimes, on a slate like this where ownership is pretty spread out, at least right now, it doesn't change much. But there are certain slates where, when we get the occasional Andre Drummond slate where he's, min price and Embiid's out, you may be 100% exposed to Drummond. He may be your highest exposure player on the slate, but if he's 70% owned, that's not actually your biggest stand. So I like to compare ownership or exposure always relative to ownership. So let me know if that helps. But okay, so John says if we set exposures to players in step 1, then change our sliders, will those players be in step 3? Yeah, they should. So if you go in here and set, if you set your individual player exposures in step 1, you can change this. You can do whatever you want to the sliders. The exposures you've set in step 1 are independent of the individual sliders that are used. So, for example, let's just pull this up. Let's say ahead of time that you want to be at least even with the field on Steph Curry. So you set a minimum exposure of 15%. Right, that will apply whether your sliders are here or here. So cool. All right, we'll go ahead and leave it there for today. Thank you, everybody that tuned in and watched or listened to the show, asked questions, participated here. We will be right back again tomorrow, same time, same place, 2 p.m. Eastern, and that will be my last day on office hours here for this week. So it will be probably some combination of Andy or Chris or other folks on the team taking care of office hours here for you for the rest of the week. So you'll get an opportunity to hear a different voice, see a different face, hear some different perspectives through the end of the week. And then I will be right back again here next week on Monday. So looking forward to seeing you guys all again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern. Enjoy the new groups functionality if you're playing DFS tonight. And especially if you have a little bit of time to play around with it, maybe an hour before lock, maybe not right up against lock where you're under the time pressure, but if you have a little bit of time to mess around with it, give it a try. Let us know what you think. And then until then, good luck tonight. We'll see you tomorrow. Take care.